Back in the 80s, I served as a military policeman in the United States Army. But instead of patrolling streets, I spent my 3 years working as a prison guard at the Mannheim confinement facility. The prison sat on Coleman Barracks in Mannheim, Germany, housing U.S. Army and Air Force prisoners. Coleman Barracks itself had a long history. It was originally a German airfield during World War II. It even held prisoners of war during World War II. By the time I was stationed there, the air base was mostly used by a U.S. Army transportation battalion. I remember seeing lots of helicopters. The prison sat about half a mile from our barracks, which was located directly across from the airfield. The road leading to the prison was a narrow, winding strip of asphalt. On one side of the road, a set of railroad tracks ran alongside a small grove of trees, ending at an embankment that rose high enough to block the view beyond it. On the other side, a marshy field stretched out, dotted with large mounds that resembled grassy hills during the day, but at night, staring out at them from the road, they looked creepy. My buddies and I once tried to explore them, hoping to find an entrance, but they were all flooded. Whatever secrets they held were long buried. One rainy night, I was working tower duty at the prison. My relief was about 20 minutes late. I don't remember why, but I remember not being happy about it. When I finally climbed down from the tower, I had to turn in my equipment at the front gate before heading back to the barracks. It was pouring. The walk back was miserable on nights like this, but I got lucky. My buddy Billy was also getting off late. He worked in the admin office, and unlike me, he had a car. Normally we all walked, but when it rained, anyone with a car became the most popular person around. That night, it was just Billy and me heading back. We pulled out of the prison parking lot and started down the narrow road, the headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. As we rounded the first bend, something caught our eye. A man. He was walking briskly on the side of the road, hunched against the rain. He wore a fedora-style hat, a long trench coat that reached his knees, the collar flipped up against the wind. In one hand, he carried a briefcase. Billy slowed as we passed him. Through my window, I got a clear look at the guy. He had his head tucked low, rain streaming off the brim of his hat. He was wearing glasses, but I couldn't see his eyes. He never turned to look at us, never acknowledged the car at all. We rounded another curve and lost sight of him. Billy and I sat in silence for a beat before looking at each other and acknowledging that was out of place. There was no reason for anyone to be walking on that road at night. The prison wasn't open to civilians, and the only other buildings nearby were the barracks and the airfield. No one should have been out there. As we neared the end of the road, I said, "Hey, let's turn around." We made a quick U-turn and headed back toward the prison. The headlights swept over the wet asphalt. We drove the entire stretch of road. The man was gone. There were no turnoffs, no paths, just a flooded marsh on one side and a wet, muddy embankment on the other. Even if he had decided to duck into the trees, he wouldn't have made it far, not without us seeing him. I let out a nervous chuckle. That was really creepy. Neither of us had an explanation, but we decided to report it. We drove straight to the front gate of the base and told the guards what we saw. They said nobody matching that description had come through the gate that night. They called the information into their supervisors, and that was the end of it. We never saw the man again. I never believed in ghosts, but that night, I think I might have seen one. When I was in the 7th grade, my family lived in Butzbach, Germany. My dad was stationed at a nearby army base, and we lived in an apartment complex for military families. The housing area was made up of long, 4-story apartment buildings, each with 3 stairwells, one on the left, one in the middle, and one on the right. Each stairwell had 6 apartments, 2 on each floor, up to the 3rd. The 4th floor was mostly open floor areas where various groups and clubs could gather. Each morning, 2 of my friends would walk to my apartment to meet me before school. I lived closest to the bus stop. From there, we'd take the winding stairwell down to the basement. The basement was a long, dimly lit hallway stretching the length of the building. Along both sides were wooden doors, each leading to a small storage room belonging to a tenant. In the winter, to avoid the cold, we'd cut through the basements of 2 buildings, exiting on the other side near our bus stop. The basements always felt eerie, and we never liked being down there alone. One winter morning, like any other, my friends arrived at my door. My father had already left for work, and my mom was busy getting my little brother ready for school. I grabbed my lunch, yelled goodbye, and we headed down the stairs. As we reached the last set of stairs leading into the basement, something immediately caught my eye. Golf clubs. They were scattered on the stairs, lying across the concrete floor. That alone was odd, but before I could process it, a figure stepped into view from the basement hallway. To this day, I still don't know if it was a man or a woman. They were wearing a filthy yellow jumpsuit with red fringes at the wrists and neck. The fabric was smeared with dark stains like it had been worn for weeks without a wash. Its hair was wild, frizzy, and bright orange red. It stuck out in every direction. It could have been a wig. Its face was smeared with something red, like lipstick, but messier. It immediately made me think of Ronald McDonald, the fast food mascot. Only this guy looked like a psycho. In one hand, they gripped a golf club. It stood still for a moment, staring up at us. Then it let out a sound, a gurgling, choked scream. Its mouth opened wide as it made the noise. That was enough for us. My friends and I turned and bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time until we reached my apartment. We pounded on the door, gasping for breath as we tried to explain what we'd seen. My mom, probably assuming we were exaggerating, calmed us down and then knocked on our neighbor's door. Our neighbors had a teenage son, Cal, who was a senior in high school. He was built like a football lineman, 6 feet tall, at least 250 pounds. My mom asked him to come downstairs with us. I felt better with Cal there, but I wished my dad was there. With Cal leading the way, we cautiously descended back into the basement. The golf clubs were still there, but now we noticed something else. Our storage room door was wide open. It was the very first door on the right as you stepped into the basement tunnel. My dad's golf bag was on the ground inside, the clubs strewn about. Someone had gone through our things, but whoever or whatever we had seen was gone. The basement was empty. We never found out who that person was or how they got into our storage room, but from that day on, my friends and I stuck to walking outside the buildings. We never went through the basements again, not even to escape the cold and dark winter mornings. It was the mid-1980s when my husband Michael and I took a job at Frankfurt American High School. We were both teachers, and the opportunity to live and work in Germany was exciting, but housing was a challenge. Department of Defense, or DoD as it was known, their housing was limited, and until something opened up, we had to rent a small, overpriced apartment in the city. We were desperate for a place on base, where the rent was free and the commute was shorter. So, when a 3-bedroom cottage became available, we took it immediately. The man handling our paperwork mentioned, almost offhandedly, that someone had died in the house, but that it was over 20 years ago. He didn't give details and we didn't ask. People die in houses all the time, right? It wasn't something to worry about, or so we thought. At first, things were normal. Our daughter Emily, 14 at the time, adjusted well. Our son, Jacob, 6, loved the new house. It had a big backyard, and his room was just the right size for him. A few weeks after we moved in, he started talking about his new friend. An imaginary friend wasn't unusual for a kid his age, so we didn't think much of it. But as time passed, Jacob changed. He became obsessed with his room, reluctant to leave it even when we called him for dinner. At night, we'd hear him whispering, carrying on full conversations. I asked him once who he was talking to. He just smiled and said, "My friend." "What's your friend's name?" Jacob turned serious. "I can't tell you," he said. "It's a secret." That should have been my first real warning, but I brushed it off. Kids have active imaginations. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the floor. Half asleep, I listened. It sounded like a piece of furniture being dragged across the floor. I jumped out of bed, yelling, "Wake up," to Michael. I ran into the kitchen just as Jacob, standing on a chair, reached for the stove knobs. He turned one, just a little, and I reached forward, grabbing him before he could go further. The gas hissed faintly before I shut it off. Michael rushed in, finding me holding Jacob, shaking. I asked Jacob what he was doing, but he seemed confused, almost like he had done it in his sleep. I gently shook him and looked directly at him and said, "Why did you turn on the stove?" Still half asleep, Jacob replied, "Eric told me to do it." "Who's Eric?" I said a little too loudly. Jacob startled awake and looked as if he was about to cry. "He's my secret friend." That scared me a bit, but Jacob did seem out of it. Maybe it would all make sense in the morning. We put Jacob back to bed. I barely slept that night. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The next morning, still shaken, I walked down the street to visit my neighbor, Maggie Wells. Maggie was a veteran teacher, a kind woman in her 60s who had lived there for years. She was getting ready to retire, and in the short time we'd been there, we'd become friends. Over coffee, I told her that Jacob had been acting strangely, his imagination running wild. I laughed nervously, downplaying it, but admitted that something about it unsettled me. Then, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned that the person who assigned us the house had said someone died there years ago, but I didn't have any details. Maggie frowned, stirring her coffee slowly. "You know," she said after a pause, "I do remember something about that cottage. It must have been 25 years ago. A military family lived there. Their little boy died. It was strange, I think, mysterious circumstances." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "What happened?" I asked. Maggie shook her head. "I don't remember exactly. Some people said it was an accident, but I always got the sense that there was more to it." She paused, thinking. What was the name of that little boy? She snapped her fingers. "Eric. That was it. His name was Eric." The moment she said it, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced back through the past few weeks. Jacob wouldn't say his friend's name at first. He became obsessed with his room. He stayed up whispering at night. And last night he turned on the gas because Eric told him to. I left Maggie's in a daze, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. I ran back to the house. I told Michael what Maggie had just told me. Michael immediately began packing. "I don't care if we have to sleep in a hotel," he said firmly. "We're not staying here another night." We left that afternoon, crammed into a hotel for a few weeks until we found a small apartment. We finished the school year and moved back to the States the moment our contracts ended. Jacob never mentioned Eric again. He doesn't remember any of it now, but I do, and I still don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in what happened to us in that house.